do you really need a buyer's agent, particularly if you're adding another 15K or more in fees to your property purchase cost? Well, to answer this from a position of authority, we're joined by PK, who's an active property investor and educator and the managing director of Consulting by PK, who helps investors from all over Australia to buy property all over Australia by accessing a unique data-led strategy. Let's start by asking you, how do you develop a strategy without a buyer's agent?
It's such a good question. I think I'll preface this by saying that a lot of content these days is dominated, for better or worse, by buyer's agents. So it's almost like the default for someone who's working a 9 to 5 to say, I don't know anything about property, therefore I must have a buyer's agent to develop a strategy for me. Now, the reality is that a true long-term portfolio strategy or property strategy answers questions like, what is your goal in 10, 15, 20 years' time? Is that goal, as good as it is to have, actually achievable based on your current income, your future income potential, your husband or wife, and how that couples on to the financial story, how many properties you'll need, what is the frequency of those purchases, what is the yield, what is the purchase price of that portfolio buildup, how long that's going to take in the accumulation phase, how long do you hold it, sell it. There's a lot of moving parts. It's not a simple download my free ebook 10 properties in 10 years. That's not quite how it works. And you'd be forgiven if you're new to thinking like that is achievable, but the reality, and I'm not saying it's not achievable, reality is that for most people it's not as simple as let's just get a property every year and we'll retire in 10 years with 10 properties. And my contention with buyer's agents, although as you said a good buyer's agent is very good, is that a buyer's agent typically doesn't play the role of building a strategy, insofar as they don't sit down with you and answer each of these questions that I've just mentioned. Rather, they'll bring that long-term strategy, if it even exists, into a more narrower, I don't want to use the word myopic, but let's say short-term view, and say, all right, PK, or all right, Bushy, what state do you want to buy in next? What's your yield that you're chasing, and what's your budget? All right. And maybe you have some other brief, inclusions like I want a corner block, I want this or that. That's really the extent to which the buyer's agent will develop a strategy for you or with you, and then they'll go off and try to fulfill it. But really, is that a strategy? And my answer to that question, my humble self, I sort of say that a true strategy, whether it's long-term or short-term, is built with the conjunction or with the help of a good mortgage broker, a good accountant as well. Okay, so a good mortgage broker, for example, will sit down and say, look, PK, right now you have an income of $90,000 per year. Now that's not going to get you too many properties, but let's see how many dependents you have at the moment, how that dependents or kids story will unfold. What's your plans? What's your spouse's income? How's the career progression going to go? There's a long-term model that needs to be built up. And then in the long term, they'll say, all right, for you to get to this portfolio value, you probably need properties that yield above X, or at least between X and Y. And therefore, PK, you probably need to be buying properties that are under 500, under 600, under 700K, because if you buy that blue chip, quote unquote, property in Sydney, well, you never will come to me again because you'll be capped out of your borrowing capacity. So these conversations, I'm simplifying here, but these conversations need to be had with a really good mortgage broker who's kind of been there and done that. Hopefully they're an investor themselves. And then you marry that up with a good accountant and say, okay, for me to maximize my borrowing capacity, for me to protect my assets, for me to actually be most efficient in my tax structure, no one likes paying tax, how do I buy this? Maybe for the first one or two, I buy in my own name. Then I look to more complex structures like trusts or whatever. But these things need to be done with these three parties, yourself, the mortgage broker, and accountant, at a virtual table, let's say, and hashing it out. It's a three-way conversation, not a 1 hour strategy call, quote unquote, with a buyer's agent. Those are some heavy words, but I think it needs to be said.
You're absolutely spot on. And I've always said that a strategy, when we're talking in property terms, needs to look at lifestyle strategy. It needs to look at finance strategy and capability. And then the property strategy falls out of the bottom of that if you've answered all those questions appropriately. What you've just been talking about in relation to the very short-term reactive, what sort of property am I going to buy now? That's a tactic, not a strategy. So a very big difference between the two. And I guess the unfortunate thing, PK, is that a lot of people are so focused on just the property solution that they don't see the benefit of those bigger questions that you've just talked about. So I absolutely reinforce in conjunction with you the need to get those three key players around the table, and perhaps a qualified property investment advisor out of Pippa who has that strategic outlook and the ability to actually put those strategies together. So very well said.